That's true. Naked Palpatine.
Oh, you pick that one. Fresh out of the clone tank, nude Palpatine is my
Well, that's the first thing I think of when you say Dark Empire Palpatine.
Hello, everyone. I don't know what to make a little slogan for this video. Rip off of Sherlock Holmes but not at all, and so much more. Today, taking a small departure from the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, because, you know, as each book ends up being 1,000 pages, you kind of need a breather here and there. So, I picked up and decided to review the Bauchelain and Korbal Broach short story collection, Volume 1. So the thing about this, if you haven't read Memories of Ice, it doesn't really matter, but these characters pop up in that book first, but they're only in about, like, 50 pages out of 1,000, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but they're not in a lot of the book. But when they do show up, they're super memorable. So, Steven Erikson, I don't have the full backstory, but he decided to write some short stories with them. And what I think is absolutely amazing about this series is just how fun it is. And something I've noticed is I've watched, you know, every time I finish a book, it's kind of like this religious ritual now where I have to go and watch like a podcast or a discussion, spoiler, on that book, you know, so long as it's not spoiling future books. Because I have to, you know, I don't have too many people to talk to about it, so I gotta, like, you know, besides one, because Marcel the Revanchist on YouTube, he's also read he hasn't read this yet. He's going to now because I'm reading it, but he has read all of Malazan and stuff and spin-offs, except for these. Anyway, but so I've been watching a lot of those and stuff, and one thing that some of them have interviewed Steven, and one thing that Steven, you know, has said time and time again is that he learning how to write and everything, he excelled in being a short story writer. And with all of his novels, he basically treats each individual scene as sort of like a short story that eventually all culminates in connecting and fitting at the very end. But here, these are all short stories, right? So you really get to see, like, his, you know, people make jokes about the Sanderlanche, the whole thing where Brandon Sanderson always has to have this big crescendo at the end of his book and ties everything together, makes everything fit. You're like, bam, 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 that's amazing. But that's exactly what Erikson does. It's just that you have to sit most of the time through like 1,000 pages of stuff, and it's a lot of stuff and it's dense. And so you often don't remember every little tiny bit, but at the same time, the stuff that you do remember, when it all finally culminates in that finale, you're like, damn, that's amazing. How he does that consistently and often. But with this, it's a lot more apparent because it's a short story. They're about 100 pages each, you know, give or take a little bit more. So you really get to see, like, characters, this and that. Everything in the short story matters. There's nothing there just for the sake of it. It all will come to fruition in the end, and you really get to see that payoff very clearly in here, as where the other stuff you may forget little tidbits and stuff because it's a 1,000-page book. And I think it works really, really well. The first story, without spoilers, is basically an origin story to these characters. We learn how Reese, Emancipier Reese, is a father to two kids who probably aren't his because they don't look a lot like him. His wife hates him. He's trying to find work. He always gets drunk or high, and he does an interview with Bauchelain. And other stuff happens that I won't get into a non-spoiler, but that's essentially that story. The second story, Bauchelain, Reese, and many other characters are on this boat, and a lot of crazy shenanigans ensue. And then the final story, Bauchelain visits this city where they have very specific laws, and it's very fun and there's a demon who's very weak because nobody's giving in to their hedonistic lifestyles. So he's very small and pathetic. Um, I'll say the last story was my favorite of the three, like by bar none. But non spoiler wise, that's kind of synopsis of these three. Do you need these to understand Malazan? No. Do you even need Malazan to understand these stories? Not really either. I mean, there's some references to like creatures or spells, or not spells, but like there's just terminology that like is you be right at home if you've already read some of these books. Whereas if you haven't read any Malazan book, then it might go over your head. But for the most part, you could read these books. You could read at least this one absolutely fine without ever having read a Malazan book. Um, but I wouldn't recommend this as like a starting point because this is definitely a different tone than what Malazan is usually. But it's a fun departure. It's a nice little reprieve from that. But I think it is absolutely worth your time. It is so good. I have a little bit more gripes with 1 and 2 in terms, even though it's a short story, I feel like it's paced a little weird. Mostly just because in the first two, like Steven just can't help himself. Like he has to just introduce character after character after character, and it's only like 100-page short story, and I feel like I don't have enough time to care about these people. And maybe that's not true because written other. I've cared about others of his characters in only 100 pages. So like Guardians of the Moon, I already cared about those characters. So I just think it's with those stories for some reason I just couldn't connect necessarily to those characters as much. I mean I didn't hate them, but I didn't love them. But the third one, hook, line, and sinker, beginning to end, brilliant. The most to say, the most parody, the most humor, and yeah, I loved it. Bauchelain, such a fun character. So is Korbal Broach, who also is like hardly there, except for when he's needed to be. And Reese as the sort of straight man that just gets high and is like, you know what, frick it, yep, whatever. You know, to kind of just stay sane through it all. Sane. Um, but I really love how the Bauchelain and Korbal kind of like, you know, they're not exactly normal, but alas, like it's more the stuff that happens around them that is often their fault that is the more crazy than them themselves. But it's also insane how powerful they are. Like you read this and you go back to Malazan, like book 3, and you're like, they could have taken out like the majority of the bad guys that was going on in book 3, but they just didn't want to. Like, um, actually, it's a very dark version of like Tom Bombadil. You know, like Tom Bombadil couldn't be affected by anything. He was the strongest character in the setting, could do whatever he wanted. Um, it's kind of like that with Bauchelain and Korbal, like where they're very dark comedy, seemingly immense power, very close to Quick Ben, probably one of the strongest beings in the setting so far that we've seen, and yeah, they could be super helpful, but they don't want to be. So there's your excuse for why, in Lord of the Rings you always have, well, why don't the eagles take them all the way to the mountain or whatever? But in this, it's just, well, they don't want to help you because they don't care. And that's all you really need, right? And then you can go on their own adventures and have fun with that. So, um, if you're going through Malaz and you're like, this is a lot of fun, but you're like, you need a break from these long stories back to back to back, this short story I highly recommend to you. Anyway, that's my non-spoiler. I'm going to talk about the specifics of some of these stories in the spoiler section, but I absolutely, these books are slept on, or at least I desperately looked for spoiler reviews of this on YouTube. I could barely find any, so people aren't talking about this, at least on YouTube, that much. I hope that changes, because these should be talked about more. They're so good. They're so good. It's honestly, it's made me appreciate Erickson's writing even more. I mean, I appreciate it a lot because those 3 Malazan books are incredible. Even if I'm not into it the entire time I'm reading it, I still love it. And anytime I feel like I'm bored with Malazan, I always push through because I know at the very end everything's gonna come together. And I'm like, oh God, of course! Like this is really gonna a reread will really make me reappreciate a lot of this stuff a lot more than the initial onset of reading it. Um, but this by itself, in its own little vacuum, is a splendid and fun time. And you know what? This might get you into it, actually. You know what? You know what? I said read Malazan. You know what? If you don't know if you want to invest in 1,000-page stories, okay, 10 books each with spin-offs and whatnot. If you don't know if you're ready for that, pick up this short story collection. It's Halloween time. I feel like this kind of works with that Halloween setting, or at least at the time that I'm recording this. By the time you're watching this, we're already near the end of November, or we're in December now. I don't know. Maybe even 2025, I'm not sure. But as for me, it's still October. But regardless, it's read it. It's fun, and I think you'll have a great time with it if you give it a shot. Getting into spoilers now. If you don't want that, get out of here. Okay. So starting with, we have book 1, Blood Follows. Emancipator Reese, pissed. He's unemployed. He doesn't want to work because of the murders, because there's a bunch of murders going on in town. I wonder who could be committing these murders. There's this new character we get introduced to named Sergeant Gold, and he's wishing to know who's causing the murders. He's looking into it. And then I thought myself very, very clever with this one. There's a movie called Interview with a Vampire. So for this note, I wrote Interview with a Necromancer, because Emancipator Reese, in his drunken stupor, goes to be interviewed by the necromancer Bauchelain and gets hired to be a manservant, which recontextualizes a lot. So Reese, sort of the straight man, is doing all this to pay for his kids' like school and their house and his wife, all of which his wife probably doesn't love him, is probably sleeping with other men. I mean, hell, those kids aren't his, and he's still paying for them. And he's going through all these wacky and crazy adventures with Bauchelain and Korbal just to pay for family that probably doesn't care about him. Like, that's crazy. And he's a veteran. So, all that's, like, just so much there. They say Reese will die laughing, which is interesting. He's, like, Bauchelain says he can sense it. They also make an interesting comment that necromancy is the threshold of Hood's warrens. Like, they're on the precipice of it, and they're like tapping into it, but they're not like going into the warren completely. Also, Hood, like the Lord of Death, absolutely hates Korbal. Like in every story, Hood is trying to butcher freaking Korbal. It's crazy. Then we move on to the second story. At the end of the first story, they get on a boat to go on their next adventure. So it should be theoretically soon afterwards. But we have the second story, The Lees of Laughter's End. We get introduced to a few characters like Aptly Druther, Heck. What the heck? That's a character name. Manseed the Luckless. Bauchelain makes Reese quit drugs, so that's fun. Because he says, I need you to be focused, and also you're more boring when you do drugs. We have a lich in this story. We also have Korbal Broach doing some fishing. Why? Well, we'll see later. Also, there's a homunculus that Korbal Broach has been working on, and the homunculus fights this lich, which is interesting. Also, the lich is like a collection of like dead souls or something. I'm a little confused on the details there. But one of them is Reese's former boss, which, again, connections, because it was mentioned in the first book, which I just thought was crazy. And a lot of crazy stuff happens on the ship. A lot of deaths. A lot of people get their limbs severed. It's not a fun time. Wrong after wrong after wrong, things go wrong. It's not fun. My only problem with the story, mainly, there's a section where I think, if I read it correctly, Reese accidentally gave Bauchelain the wrong wine, which was blood wine or something. And this wine is like a magical wine. I think Love Potion number 9, sort of, kind of. If you don't know what that is, that's a deep cut reference to like an 80s or 90s movie. Anyway, but basically, whoever drinks it gets super lustful. Okay, so this lady drinks it. She gets super lustful. She kisses Bauchelain. And Bauchelain, also, if you kiss somebody with that, after having drank that, then it makes them super lustful. So then they basically have sex. But it is sort of the woman in this instance feels that it is rape, um, which yes, and I don't know. I think I would have been more okay with it if it was taken more seriously. I don't know, because like you could make the stance that it's not rape because they were both kind of like under this magical influence, and I don't think that was necessarily Bauchelain's intent. But at the same time, I feel like Bauchelain's powerful enough to kind of like. I mean, I don't have any evidence of this, but I assume Bauchelain's powerful enough to kind of resist it. I don't know. I don't. It's a blight on this particular book because it's treated entirely as a joke, and I just don't. I just didn't vibe with it. I just didn't. But that's my only problem with that story. But it's okay because we move on to my favorite part of this book, which is the final story, The Healthy Dead. Also, this takes place 4 years later, so I don't know if there's a chronological order of just these short stories, but we're already going out of it, but I'm just going to go by what's released in the books. I mean, there's a story that takes place after the last story we talked about, not this one, but after the last one with the boat. But that didn't come out to 2012, so it's like, I don't know, man. But I'm just going to go as it was released, and I won't focus too much on the details of where it's meant to be placed. Until reread, of course, where I will read everything in chronological order as best I know how. As I said, there's a vice demon who's lonely and wishes more people were giving into their vices. Also, this city called Quaint, and then Bauchelain's like, I don't see what's quaint about it. He's like, no, that's the name, Quaint. Oh, it was fun. But there's this whole religious government structure, and there are these saints, and you can become a saint by injury. So if you injure yourself on the job, you become a saint and you never have to work again. But you also never get money again. So, but it just made me think of the Vong from New Jedi Order, like embrace the pain. The more pain, the better you are, the more scars you have. So it was a fun little parallel there. But yeah, this actually became like a really deep thing for a big part of this book. I mean, it's comedy, but it's wrapped in this actual substance of actually trying to say something, which I felt like the first two weren't, where this one actually has like an active thing with it. But basically, these two people in the city, they say, we'll pay you, Bauchelain, if you can kill our king. Because their king is kind and merciful. Not really, but they claim that their king is kind and merciful and they want him gone. And Bauchelain says, there are worse things than a considerate king. But yeah, so he accepts because money. But it's not even really about the money. It's more just like a challenge. Like, oh, that's something that's a little bit tricky, but I'm down to attempt the challenge. Um, and then Bauchelain gets really philosophical because he starts talking about how like every tyranny is possible when prefaced by the well-being of the populace. We're doing this for your good. This is why it needs to be done. Also, we have this whole thing of desire for goodness leads to the end of civilization, which I also thought was super interesting because then we get in this whole thing of, about well-being. But what does well-being mean? And this is like a double thing because this is mostly about health, like fitness, because that's kind of like what the parody is with the town itself or with the city is with health. Like babies get thrown to the wolves if they barf or poop in their diaper, which they're babies, so you can imagine a lot of babies didn't make it out of that city. But it's this whole thing with health and wellness, but then also like government and society. There's a lot to it. But it's interesting though because wellness is, what does that mean? What does well-being mean? Like that's all entirely subjective, and it's kind of like the futility of like and no knock to you if you do it. Everybody has their thing, and I want to get in better shape because I'm starting to grow. And not even grow. I have like a sort of a beer belly or a dad body right now, which I feel I'm too young to have. But so there's this thing of like there's people who spend their entire lives at the gym, right? They just make themselves as buff as can be the most fit they can be, and for what? You know, I mean, I know there's people in their 70s that still look amazing, but at some point you will get too old to be able to maintain that, and you will just, I work at a retirement place. These people are getting into their 80s or 90s, their hundreds, some of them. At some point, your body's just not going to let you. You won't be able to be in peak physical physique. Maybe for most of your life, but at some point, it's gonna go away. So isn't it ultimately futile? But then at the same time, to counter that, it's also like, but you also can't just give in to any vice you want. You can't just have the most fun with the time you have, because like you may make your time sooner than need be. Like whether that be drugs or whatever. So there's a balance there. But then there's also the case to be made that it deals with. I think it's a double thing of religion, but then also just politics in general, and this would apply to everyone. If you're thinking about the opposite person, then you're part of the problem. It's everyone. But the whole idea is that, at least if I'm understanding correctly, that pompousness, self-righteousness comes in when you're trying to make the world for the greater good for other people, and you start believing yourself above certain people. And that you're better than this person or that person, and that this person is vile and scum, but I'm not. This person is vile and disgusting views, but I don't. I'm enlightened. I'm superior. And that really, that is the downfall of the destruction of civilization. And that can apply to literally everybody, especially in 2024. And this was written in like 2004 or something. So I was 3 years old at the time, but it's still very relevant now. And I was just really impressed. And I mean, I already knew he could do stuff like this. He's been doing it for 3 books now with Malazan. But for such a short story to have all this stuff in there was really cool. I'm not necessarily saying what my opinion is on any of that. I'm just saying, like, that's what I was getting from it. And even back to the fitness thing, where like gyms and stuff, or like being fit, as is a common thing with people these days, is in itself a luxury of a prospering society, because those who are working all the time, those who are toiling, they don't have the time to worry about being physically fit because they're working constantly. But so only in a prosperous working society necessarily can people even worry about their fitness. But there's just a lot. There's a lot that could be said there, and definitely there are podcasts like the I haven't watched it yet. I'm going to. The 10 Big Books podcast. They did a video on this, or you can listen to it on Spotify or on YouTube. And 10 Big Books is the name. A podcast, and they talked about this book, but it's just so I'm sure they went into that a bit more, but so on top of that we get all of that, plus we just get a lot of great humor throughout the story. Like, this is probably the funnest and funniest one of the 3 shorts. Reese lies about bonking head and not remembering anything, and he's sanctified, which I just think is hilarious. One of the characters, the woman, I forget her name, but she killed her husband because he didn't pee in the toilet and he didn't wipe after, which, gross, and learn how to aim. But she considered it a mercy since he wasn't aiming correctly, and how embarrassing that must have been for him, and so threw him down the stairs and killed him. Absurd, but hilarious. And I already kind of went with Bauchelain on exercise. But yeah, overall, I think it was absolutely phenomenal, this story. I mean, I like 1 and 2. I think the pacing's a little bit not as great. I don't find it as funny, perhaps. But this one, funny, philosophical, and just fun. Fun is such a subjective term, but this was the standout of the book. And so if you read nothing else, you should definitely read this. But yeah, this is probably the most normal review I've been able to do for a Malazan book, because it's not actually a Malazan book. It's not 1,000 pages, so I could actually succinctly give my thoughts properly in like a 20-minute video, which is nice for once, because I always feel like I'm just like a loser, just like saying random things from the book, because it's really hard to kind of like review Malazan because it's so long. And there's so much you could talk about that it really requires like a podcast format, but alas. Um, but yeah, it's been great. It's been a lot of fun, and I recommend you check it out. And until next time, watch out, because the cripple gods still be scheming. Till then, I'll see you when we return with Malazan Book 4, House of Chains. Till then, bye-bye.